Hello and welcome to ORF Middle East. My name is Manna Jaspal and I'm the Director and Fellow for Climate and Energy here. And today we have here, we're here today for a very timely and important conversation titled The Hormuz Moment, Energy Security in an Age of Geopolitical Disruptions. And I'm very delighted to be joined by a very fantastic panel of experts, colleagues and friends whose work many of you will be familiar with. I have with me Robin Mills, who's the CEO of Qamar Energy, Lee Chen Sim, Associate Fellow with the Middle East Institute, Mikhail Medan, the Director of the Climate Energy Program at the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, Kaveri Ganpati, the Fellow for Climate and Energy at ORF Middle East, and Robert Mogielnicki, Non-Resident Fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute. So welcome to you all. I'm just going to, like I said, set a very brief context, and then we're going to jump right into the questions. Over the past week, we've noticed tensions around the Strait of Hormuz have escalated dramatically following the US-Israel strikes on Iran. Energy markets have clearly reacted very sharply. Both Brent and WTI crude briefly peaked around 120 per barrel before cooling slightly to just about 90 USD per barrel this morning. The stakes are enormous. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's most critical energy choke points, with nearly 20% of global oil and LNG supplies passing through this very narrow waterway. Even the threat of disruption has sent shockwaves through energy markets, shipping routes, and global economies. At the same time, attacks on energy infrastructure have compounded the crisis. As we speak, both the sources of production and the channels of transportation are being increasingly weaponized. Iran missile and drone strikes targeting West Asian neighbors have damaged several critical energy assets, including production facilities, refineries, and ports. So, from the Asian import dependence to European diversification efforts to very strategic role of Gulf producers and the stagflation concern courtesy high energy prices, there's clearly a lot to unpack today. And I'm going to, Robin, turn to you first. You've been closely following the Gulf energy markets for decades, and you've seen clearly several crises unfold in the region. We're already seeing disruptions in infrastructure, shipping routes, and insurance markets. From a market perspective, how serious do you see is the current disruption risk to global energy supplies, and how resilient do you see or do you think are the Gulf energy systems today compared with previous crises, say the tanker wars of the 80s? And how would you differentiate this crisis from, changes in energy systems as noticed more recently with the Russia-Ukraine war and even the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, thank you, Manata, and thanks to everybody for attending. Look, this crisis is as serious as it gets, and we can look back at past crises. Yeah, the 1980s tanker war, yeah, and the 1990 Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. It's a little bit before my time professionally, but well within my lifespan, and I'm sure I and others have studied them pretty carefully for their lessons. And more recently, some of the other disruption you mentioned, obviously the invasion of U.S. invasion of Iraq, various rounds of tensions with Iran, and then in the reverse direction, a shock of a different type with COVID and and a bit outside this region, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So a whole set of shocks which we can draw on, but nothing quite like this. Nothing quite like having the world's premier oil and gas artery completely shut off for a period of time. And how long the time is, we have to see. But every day that goes by, when you're having a heart attack, you can have a heart attack in minutes or hours, but not in days and weeks. So this is absolutely a critical crisis, and I think something we all planned for, all had contingencies for, but never really expected it would play out in real life.
Right. And how do you see the Gulf economies really looking to reroute shipping, supplies or production supplies? And what's really their mitigation strategy?
Well, the Gulf countries have all had their own strategies for resilience and planned for this, but there's only so much they can do, right? So Saudi Arabia has a pipeline to the Red Sea, which I'm sure we'll discuss extensively on this session. The UAE has a pipeline to the Indian Ocean. So both of those countries can bypass a fair amount of their oil exports around the Strait of Hormuz. Not all, but a fair piece. Some of the other Gulf countries are completely exposed. If we take Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, they have no alternative route out, whether for oil or for gas. Iraq has very limited ways out, very insufficient. Those countries, for practical purposes, pretty much 100% dependent on the Gulf, and that's a fact of geography. You could dream up things they might have done differently, perhaps, particularly in the case of Iraq. But Qatar is stuck in the middle of the Gulf. There's very little it could have done otherwise. So, I mean, there are some methods, of course, storage of oil and gas outside the Gulf, managing relations with its customers through trading, drawing on being able to buy and sell commodities, maybe the flexibility or ability to shift delivery dates or locations. There's a certain amount of flexibility in the system, but it's far from sufficient to deal with a crisis of this magnitude.
Right. So I think, with like you very rightly said, UAE, Saudi, Oman do have alternate routes, but Qatar not so much. And that's probably why the gas markets don't have the degree of flexibility that oil markets do. But I think it's very interesting to note that US and Israel have yet to sort of attack the Iran's production facilities, particularly the Kurg Island. Why would any thoughts on that?
Well, yes, so far there's been a reluctance by the US and Israel to attack Iran's energy facilities. Israel did destroy 2 oil storage depots around Tehran over the past couple of days. Now, they would say that was striking at Iranian logistics and military supplies and so on. But other than that, there hasn't really been a direct attack on Iran's energy. And if we go back to the previous round of fighting in June last year, was much less serious, but there were a couple of attacks on gas facilities, but again, quite limited. And I think that's really around, partly around setting a precedent. The Gulf, particularly the US, doesn't want to set a precedent where the Gulf becomes a target and where Iran can say we're attacking Gulf energy facilities directly because we're retaliating against something that was done to us. Look, I think that temptation is very much there anyway, but it would be even more so if there's a precedent. And partly because the US in particular, less so Israel, doesn't want to scare markets. And once you see physical damage to oil facilities, including Iranian ones, then the market will get much more nervous. And you've seen a lot of efforts by the US over the past couple of days by Donald Trump, by Energy Secretary Chris Wright, and others to talk down the seriousness and say, look, there's plenty of supplies on the way, the war's winding up. I think pretty unclear how true all that is, and some of these statements have then been withdrawn. They're clearly an attempt to talk things down, and bombing oil and gas facilities would be going precisely the wrong way, because the US and Donald Trump recognizes how vulnerable he is, having chosen this war, how vulnerable he is if US gasoline prices at the pump start going up.
Right. And I think, like you rightly pointed out, that while Trump is trying to assuage investors and markets by making these statements, but at the same time, we hear Iran saying things like that they want the oil prices to go up to $200 and they're willing to do anything in order to, get what they want out of this deal. Or out of this situation. So I think that brings me to you, Lee Chen. Given that we're hearing such conflicting statements, clearly the importers of energy from the region are going to be bearing the most brunt of this situation. And clearly, Asian economies that are depending increasingly on the supplies. For example, almost 70% of the oil that is shipped through the Hormuz goes to, Asia, which is most notably China, India, Japan, and Korea. So how exposed do you think are Asian economies to these disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz? While I'd like Mikhail to talk about China, but I'm more interested and keen to hear from you how Russia is looking at this whole situation. Many call it, the beneficiary in all of this. They might emerge as a beneficiary out of all of this because the demand for their energy supplies will only increase, demand as well as price. What are your thoughts?
Hey, thank you for that. So you posed 2 questions. The answer to your first question about Asia, Asia is not merely exposed, but I would say extremely vulnerable to disruptions right now in the Hormuz. Something like 85% of crude oil that is shipped through Hormuz goes to Asia. 90% of LNG that is shipped through Hormuz goes to Asia. 80% of oil products that is shipped through Hormuz goes to Asia. More than 50% of fertilizers that is shipped through Hormuz goes to Asia, and so on and so forth. So yes, Asia is extremely vulnerable. But having said that, I think it's important to note that there are different degrees and dimensions of vulnerabilities within Asia itself. China, yes, the largest absolute volumes that go through Hormuz are destined for China. That's true. But I think we shouldn't forget that for Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, they are more impacted in terms of shares. For those three East Asian countries, something like 60 to 75% of the crude they each import is shipped via Hormuz, compared to 40% for India and China. So this is one of the shares dimension that distinguishes the different Asian countries. In terms of reserves, however, Japan and Korea have over something like 200 days of domestic consumption stored in their respective strategic petroleum reserves. So in that sense, they actually look in much better shape compared to, say, Southeast Asia. Vietnam and Indonesia, they have less than 30 days each of domestic consumption stored. Thailand has around 100 days. Singapore has no government strategic reserves, but can access commercial reserves. Some Southeast Asian countries are already trying to curtail petrol and electricity demand by, mandating some form of remote work for government or private sector, implementing odd even days for vehicles on the roads, even raising air conditioning temperatures, to about 25 degrees. So, in terms of reserves, there are different dimensions. But it's not just reserves and absolute volumes. It's also, do the Asian countries have fuel switching alternatives to mitigate, say, LNG shortfalls from Qatar for power generation? And the quick answer is that, well, India and Indonesia, they are relatively comfortable because they do have domestic coal reserves, whereas Vietnam and Singapore, they don't have indigenous coal resources, and gas dominates the energy mix. So for them, they are already placing quite expensive bids for spot LNG. So that's the answer to your first question. You did ask a second question about Russia, right? Can Russia take advantage of the Hormuz situation? And I think that actually depends on two things. One, the duration of the disruption, and two, the pain point of others. So the longer the disruption, the more complete the disruption of Gulf exports, because as Robin pointed out, some countries have alternative pipelines. So the longer and the more disruptive, the more urgent it becomes for the US, because of midterm elections and gasoline prices, to provide waivers for buyers other than India for Russian oil and LNG. The point I'm making here is that Russia itself, to answer your question, doesn't actually have very much agency over its leverage, right? It depends on others, right? The pain point of others depends on the Hormuz disruption duration. It will have to compete with Australia as a source of LNG and coal exports to Asia. And once Qatari LNG comes back online, it will also have to compete with Qatar. So while Russia does have this window of opportunity, it doesn't really control its that kind of destiny itself. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you. But I do have a quick follow-up for you on a more geopolitical level. Do you see in many ways the Cold War between, US and Russia, and now even China, really playing out in the West Asia? Is this really truly a war and conflict between China, US, and Russia that sort of in many ways we see manifesting in this part of the world?
It's a great question. For me personally, I do not think that Iran is a new theater of, what we call great power competition between the US, China, and Russia, simply because the Middle East is not and will not be a core foreign policy interest for either of these great powers. I'm not saying that the region is not important. The region is important. It is of interest to these great powers, but it is not a primary focus of their respective foreign policies. That focus lies elsewhere for all three powers. For China, it's Asia. For the US, it's Americas. And for Russia, it's the post-Soviet space / Europe. So I don't think that, this is a new theater of great power competition, because the Middle East is simply not a core pole for either of them.
Right. Let me bring you in now, Mikhail. So China clearly is the largest energy importer, and its energy security strategy has been rapidly evolving. It is believed that it does have 6 months of oil stockpile. At the same time, it is also a world leader in EV deployment. So more than half of new passenger vehicles are now new electric vehicles, and the electric cars are actually displacing over 1 million barrels per day of implied oil demand. As an electro state, China has managed to renewables account for more than 80% of its new electricity demand, and it's only increasing given its evolving targets over time. How, to what extent do you see China's reliance, on these strategic petroleum reserves? Will these reserves be able to sustain, its growth levels in the short to medium term? What are the alternate suppliers it's looking at to cushion some of these disruptions? And how would any kind of prolonged instability in the Gulf really affect China's energy security strategy?
Thank you, Manat. Thank you for, well, lots of really good questions. I think if we start, right, you're right, there's a lot of commentary on the one hand, China is hugely exposed because of the level of dependency, but equally it's hedged and it has electric vehicles. It's a combination of both, right? Because both things are true at the same time. The impact is less Iran in itself, sort of the outages in Iranian flows is less of an issue. It's obviously the Hormuz Strait and the disruptions. Where it is impactful is because it's multifaceted, right? It's crude oil, it's products, petrochemical feedstocks like LPG and naphtha that are significant. It's LNG through Qatar, that's 27% of Chinese LNG. So I think it's the combination of flows. Initially, it's the price impact more than the physical availability. There's plenty of crude on water that's heading to Asia. There's still LNG in storage. We're heading into the shoulder months in terms of gas demand. But the ripple effects, I think, will feed through over the coming months, right? Even just the price effects. Think about crude prices that then will impact LNG contracts, pipeline contracts. And just that sort of compounding crisis, I think you said that initially, the costs of all those feedstocks for chemicals, for instance, right? It's the gas and petrochemical feedstocks. There's a double whammy there of both price and potential availability. Not to talk about the implications, if this is protracted, the global economy. What happens to global demand that China taps into for its economy more broadly. So there's a lot of questions, right, about how this plays through. But I agree with what Li Chen was saying, sort of the actual physical flows of crude are manageable. It's 40 to 50%, massive number, but equally flip it on its head, it's 50% that comes from other places, right? So you can source it, albeit at a higher cost. I think the other thing, obviously, China is heavily exposed to the region more broadly. It has investments in refining, in port facilities. So there's that dimension that I think time will tell, right? We'll have to see when and where the dust settles just on some of that physical infrastructure in the region. But in the short term, it does have, I think, quite a strong buffer. But it is already doing, I think the kind of mindset is supply security and just to be able to, I guess, pace the Chinese economy in case this is a protracted outage. We're seeing run cuts, we're seeing lower utilization rates in a number of chemical facilities as well. We're seeing product exports, oil product exports that are being limited for now, again, just to make sure that there's enough in the system. China could tap into stocks. It has massive reserves of anywhere from 110 to 140 days, depending on whose numbers and depending on sort of how you calculate it. But there is a buffer there. And as you alluded to at the beginning, right, there has been an ongoing effort to diversify and electrify transport and therefore reduce reliance on fossil fuels. Now, 50% of electric vehicles in sales is massive, but in the stock of vehicles, there's still a huge amount of ICE vehicles. So, yesterday or the day before, the domestic product prices were adjusted up, and you saw queues getting into the petrol stations as people wanted to fill up because that was the day that headlines of $100 oil broke. So there is a sensitivity, right? But there is a huge ability to cushion and buffer it. But again, I think one of the concerns is that there's these ripple effects that will happen over the coming weeks. And in terms of energy security, again, there's perception and reality. Yes, the Chinese system is relatively insulated. Again, look at, as you were saying, sort of power supplies are predominantly domestic. It's coal, renewables, hydro, nuclear. 3% of China's power generation is gas. It's nothing. So in that respect, it is relatively secure, but there is still that perception of risk and concern about, again, all these sort of ripple effects.
Yes, and I mean, like you said, energy does underpin every trade of every commodity, right? So it's not just the energy of oil and gas, but it's also other commodities associated. But also, to your point on other alternate sources. But the issue is, even if you look at non-Gulf producers, whether it's Norway or America or, in South America or Canada, in the short to medium term, very few of them will be able to expand capacities. So it will have downward pressure and it will lead to, increasing prices. So irrespective, I think there will be some effect. And I don't think China is as hedged as everyone thinks it is, and is the narrative I think that's been built out there. I think just another quick follow up to that, and maybe I want to also ask Lee Chen what her thoughts on this. That could this really lead to, the power of Siberia too? Could this really deepen Russia-China cooperation? Do we see perhaps that pipeline coming into, play more, earlier than anticipated? What really is the future of Russia-China or the power of Siberia too?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I guess to your point about the exposure, again, there is a slight difference between price versus sort of physical. And the price exposure is very real in terms of physical supplies. Yes, they can get their hands on the physical supplies at a premium, and add on to that the shipping costs, right? We're seeing freight rates going ballistic, just as crude and gas prices have. On Russia, it's an interesting one. I mean, I think there's definitely appeal of that sort of hedge, of the Russian hedge. I think as navigation conditions allow, we'll see more Arctic LNG2 flow to China. Right now, that's sort of just a bit constrained by the physical ability to navigate. But I think there's only so much sort of more that can come online through Arctic LNG2, through pipelines. Going forward, Power of Siberia 2, right? We've heard in September that it was signed, that it wasn't signed, that there was an MOU on something. We're not sure exactly what. Um, but interestingly, in the draft plan of the 15th five-year plan, so which came out last week, this is the kind of blueprint for the next 5 years, Power of Siberia 2 is mentioned in it. And that's a first, I think, formal sort of recognition. Now it's mentioned very vaguely. It's sort of accelerate Power of Siberia 2. It's a bit like signing this MOU to keep speaking. But I think it is noteworthy that it's sort of in the planning, right? We're going to dedicate money and resources to at least build the physical infrastructure, even though, as far as I understand, there's no agreement on the price, on the terms. And that seems to be the sticking point. The flip side of this, and yes, they're ideologically aligned on many things. This is a huge dependency for China. Everything that China's tried to do to date, diversify, limit its dependence on a single supplier, already in 2025, if you look at pipeline and LNG imports from Russia, they were a third of total supplies to China, which is already very, very high. So I think there's a limit to how much China's willing to be reliant on Russia, even though it is seen as the sort of bigger brother and in the relationship, or as having more power. I think there is a bit of a reluctance to put too many eggs in one basket. So I think there will be progress, but perhaps a hedged progress. And then there's a question of sort of just the physical supplies, and I think Li Chen will know more about that than I do.
Right. But I think before I move on very briefly, if this is really the inflection point that we're all hoping for, as a push for energy transitions, China is the biggest supplier of green products and green inputs around the world. How do you think this could be another advantage for the country? If we do see other countries moving more towards energy transition and energy sovereignty, and more solar and wind is going to be increasingly part of countries' mix in Asia. So that's, I think, again, a bargaining win for China in this whole play.
I think it marginally helps. Sort of the overcapacity of the phenomenal manufacturing capacity / overcapacity that exists in China has been around for many years. And what has advanced the appeal of renewables in a number of countries, especially in the global south, has just been the cost, right? The fact that they are so competitively priced and available, that's already helped boost. We're seeing solar installations in Pakistan, in Africa, skyrocket. So I think this is just an additional, I don't know if it's an accelerator yet. And there are two slight wrinkles here. The first is that actually, if this lasts, then production prices in China could go up because all the feedstock costs are rising. Provinces like Zhejiang, where we've got massive gas infrastructure, chemicals capacity, is also the biggest solar manufacturer in the world. So it doesn't offset, it doesn't change the price dynamics completely, but it does increase the pressure on the prices. Interestingly, in the Chinese commentary as well, there's a bit of a concern that countries will then be preoccupied with replenishing oil and gas reserves, and so won't have the fiscal space to do renewables. I mean, I'm not sure that's actually the case. But I think that the trend in terms of China's own decarbonization, China's push for the energy transition, the market transformations and dynamics are already set in motion, and they're already so significant that maybe there's a little bit more uptake from this latest round, from yet another crisis, especially in Southeast Asia. But I don't know that it moves the needle materially just yet.
Right. Lee-Chen, really quickly and briefly, power of Siberia, what are your thoughts? Is this
That's a great question. I agree with what Michal has said. And I want to emphasize that this current Hormuz crisis is just going to underline for China the danger of dependence, right? I've already mentioned how dependent the Asian countries are on Hormuz, on the Middle East. So China would have seen that, this just underlines the story that Michal just said, that it is dangerous to be dependent on Russia. Yes, China, Russia is, a good friend. It's got a lot of oil and LNG, etc. But to be, so dependent on one supplier, even though it may be kind of friendly, it is dangerous. And China has done a lot to diversify, whether it's, in terms of, any number of things, right? It's customers overseas, it's oil and gas sources, etc. That I think it will not want to set itself back by being too dependent on Russia and rushing ahead with the power of Siberia. What is in the plan is not, it's like an MOU, right? It's an intention, right? So I would echo Michal's caveat.
Right. Kaveri, I'm going to come to you now, closer to home, in India. India is one of the bigger economies, highly dependent on energy imports, with a significant share that comes from the Gulf. So clearly, energy prices will be impacted. Like we discussed, at least in the short to medium term, if there were, if the disruptions were to be prolonged, and given that the production facilities from non-Gulf producers will not be able to improve capacity immediately, there will be greater competition between Asia and Europe for those supplies. And clearly, Europe can, pay the higher buck. And thirdly, apart from oil and gas, we're also seeing a huge impact on food prices, particularly urea, and that's going to have an impact on our agricultural sector, which is very sensitive and very, which is very price sensitive, particularly in the Indian context. So, in your opinion, how exposed is India to clearly potential disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz in the longer run, or at least in the coming weeks? And how is the country looking to mitigate some of these risks? And what lessons should emerging economies like India draw from this crisis about building more resilient and diversified energy systems?
I wish I had a better answer, a happier answer, but significantly exposed and comprehensively exposed as well. Significantly, I say just in terms of the numbers that we have to bring in, about 80% exposure in terms of the crude oil that we bring in. So just earlier this month, March 2026, 50% of our crude transited through the Strait of Hormuz, 60% of our LNG came from there. If we are bringing in about 5 million barrels per day of crude, about 2.5 to 2.7, I think, comes in from the Strait of Hormuz, and that is substantial exposure. Importantly, like you said, if you want to diversify, if you want to get it from elsewhere, it isn't just about if they can increase capacity, it is also about the amount of time it's going to take for it to reach the geography that we're talking about, right? So if you're talking about North Atlantic, if you're talking about the Americas, there is a certain amount of time that crude takes to reach India, right? As opposed to the amount of time that it takes to reach from the Middle East. And I think that needs to be factored in as well. So there are calculations which suggest, because we are a very price-sensitive economy, even a marginal increase will have a substantive impact on our import bills. So if you're talking about a 2-month or 3-month long $10 increase, that comes to about $14 to $15 billion, all right, which is substantial for a country like us. Importantly, in India's case, very different from what Mikhail was telling us about the Chinese case. Our SPR reserves, the strategic petroleum reserves, unfortunately are not, we haven't met the mandate, not the mandate, well, the suggestion by the IEA saying 90 days. What we have just now in the 3 strategic reserves that in the 3 functional ones, we are looking at setting up more, but the 3 functional ones, so technically that's what we should be considering, is just about 9 days. And then when you add the commercial and the operational energy, which is the defense, the strategic reserves, the military, etc., keep for themselves, for their functioning, that together, that will add up to about 74 days. That is a substantial risk. Okay, so when that's going to have a cascading effect across the board. I say comprehensive because, like you said, it isn't just energy that transits the strait, right? We bring in a lot of other stuff, particularly urea, which has a great impact on an agrarian country like India. Food prices will go up. LNG, again, LNG is an important metric to speak of in this regard in India, also because it is an effort towards transition, right? It is what we were trying to do. It was the bridge fuel. It was to be the bridge fuel. So when you have a crisis like this and when prices are where they are, you do not have, so for crude, we have buffers, we have stocks, at least strategic petroleum stocks. For gas, we do not in India. I feel like that is going to have a material impact on our transition as well. So we were using LNG for transport. We were using it for industries. I think we might go back to looking at coal as well. I think that is a possibility even in the Chinese case. I think Mikhail would be able to tell us more about it. But I'm feeling like there is some kind of demand destruction that can be anticipated in countries like India and China. On the alternatives, like I said, alternatives exist. So we are looking at supply diversification, source diversification. But again, how plausible is it? And even if that diversification is happening, I look at it as a temporary one. So the moment the Strait of Hormuz opens up, hopefully, I want to say within a month, less than a month maybe, but hopefully when it does open up, the Middle East crude, the Middle East gas will still make a lot more sense for us, for our economies, right? So I think the diversification that is on in terms of where we are sourcing the fuel from, that will be a temporary change in the nature of the portfolio, the energy portfolio that we have. In terms of the mitigation, the government has come up with a few steps. One of it is the natural gas supply regulation order, whereby there have been a mandate actually, that the available gas will be used for domestic purposes, domestic consumption purposes, or household purposes, right? For hospitals and for education institutions, as opposed to selling it for commercial purposes. All commercial loading and invoicing has been suspended until they can have confirmation about more LPG shipments. To stretch available stocks, there is also, the consumers have now been told that you cannot ask for or apply for a new cylinder unless it is about 21 to 25 days since the previous delivery. So those are basic, very small changes, but in a country like India, because the numbers are so large, I think that would go a long way. I would expect there would be government intervention to cap prices and subsidize them as well. It is something that we have done before, and I expect that to happen again. There is one particular piece that I saw, and I thought that was useful for this discussion, which was the Indian National Ship Owners Association had reached out to the Indian government to try and understand why it is that Chinese ships were able to transit the Hormuz, even in this situation, whereas Indian ships were not. So I would expect some kind of a bilateral chat, perhaps, building on good offices to see if the ones that are stranded just now, at least, are allowed to move. Because this has a material impact on India's energy security, food security, human security. So
I think, like you said, energy security, food security, human security. I think in the context of India, it's way more complicated than we generally tend to, assume. But yeah, I think even with fuel caps, we've seen Japan and Korea have also imposed fuel caps more recently. So I think, there's precedent there as well. Uh, at least in the case of India, I think there is a whole push today for, accelerating energy transition as well. Particularly, do you think will this crisis really be that inflection point where the government realizes we need to, advance some of these priorities and targets more so, given our energy import dependencies can be quite critical?
I want to say yes again, because logically, on the face of it, that's what makes sense, right? This is how you hedge against geopolitical risk. This is how you hedge against volatility in energy markets, which keeps coming periodically. Well, nothing as big, like Robin pointed out, nothing. This is unprecedented, what has happened, right? So nothing as big, but every 5 years, you see it's cyclical almost. So I want to say that this will accelerate the energy transition. But Manat, I feel like it is for the day after the day after. It isn't just now. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is that the green energy, so levelized cost of energy, where you're considering solar energy in Asia, it makes abundant sense, right? So we should ideally be looking at it. But then you also have to consider that a lot of the other cleaner forms that we're talking about, these tend to be capital intensive as well. Do you have the fiscal room to invest in that just now? Perhaps not. My worry is that you will, like I said, fall back on coal. Once the dust settles on this particular crisis, I think the immediate recourse will be to the legacy hydrocarbon systems, because then you're again looking at meeting the demand of the population, right? I think this will happen, of course, in the long term. If I were to split it into a short, medium, long term, then not in the short to medium term, but in the long term, definitely. This is the only hedge that we can have, right? Cleaner forms of energy. But even in those cleaner forms of energy, I would, you asked, Mikhail, about the clean energy manufacturing that China does. I think it is very important that when we talk about transition, when countries like India particularly speak about transition and cleaner forms of energy, we do not repeat the mistakes of the past and open ourselves up to further vulnerabilities, right? So if you are not having green manufacturing happening in the country, if you are not producing the feedstock that goes into the clean energy transition, I think this is the time to take stock. Right after the crisis passes, etc., you do not swap one dependency for the other. So you're essentially opening yourself up to another vulnerability. And that is my worry about the clean energy transition even taking place. I don't mean to say it is not going to. I just don't think it's going to happen immediately. And I don't see this as an accelerator in the short to medium term, but it will happen. I also think you need government support for a lot of the clean energy infrastructure to get in place, particularly in countries like India. You've seen preferential pricing. You've seen a lot of policies that have been put in place. And I wonder if they would have that kind of room just now in the middle of this or immediately after, when they're having to, pick up the fall.
So yeah, no, and also like you said, I think a lot of the inputs for the energy transition comes from China, which is again, particularly for a country like India, we're very wary of, those dependencies, and of course, and critical minerals, which, as we all know, China really dominates most of that space, particularly in processing. So thank you for that, Kaveri. I'm going to move to you, Robert, finally. I think, with the US market, of course, we've seen the gasoline prices have risen I believe they're at the highest level since President Trump has come to office. How do you think, I think I want to ask you a more interesting question and a more political question. How visible do you think these will be to the voters, and to what degree do you think this is going to influence the midterm elections later in the year?
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a tough question to wade in on U.S. politics right now. But look, I think prices at the pump, they're very visible. You're seeing this on the news, and people, are seeing this at the pump. And I think, yeah, it's certainly going to be part of the political calculus moving forward. To what degree it's actually going to sway voters in one way or the other and have a tangible impact on elections, I can't say that right now, but I think it's going to be an important part of the rhetoric.
Right. And do you see maybe in many ways Trump thinks of this as an opportunity to flood global markets with either American or American controlled energy, say the Venezuelan crude, for example?
I'm not so sure that that was part of the strategy here. I think that the administration now finds themselves in the middle of this very complicated Iran conflict, and I think there are a lot of potentially negative implications that could come back to be difficult to manage in the political sphere back home in Washington for the Trump administration. So I think that right now the administration is probably seeking to do damage control when it comes to the impact on energy prices back in the US rather than, implement a coherent strategy.
Right. And, so I think so far, most of our conversation is focused on energy markets, and I would really love for you to chime in there as well. But I want to sort of broaden the question for you a little, given your expertise and understanding of Gulf economies too, that, given the region has been a hub for trade, logistics, finance, investments, how might this crisis really affect the broader Gulf economic model, particularly when it comes to trade, logistics, investment flows? Do you think, once the dust settles and the situation is managed and there is some form of consensus, hopefully sooner than later, it will be easy to rebuild that trust for global capital to park its money in this part of the world?
Easy, no, but doable, yes. I think it's doable. Look, the short answer is that there's no way to paint these recent developments in a positive light, and it's not right now what's happening good news for the Gulf's economic model. But I think that the more important question is really, how bad does it get? And that gets back to what Robin and Lee Chen were saying about, how long does this take and what do things look like over that time period and that time horizon? And how do these economies bounce back? I think for a long time, we've talked about the resilience of Gulf economies, and that resilience is really going to be put to the test. I mean, we've talked a lot today about the disruptions to shipping through the Strait of Hormuz and the impact that has on energy trade and energy markets. Look, it also impacts other forms of trade as well. You've got goods coming and going from the Gulf that are not necessarily energy commodities, but are important to these economies too. Lots of food is coming into the region, like rice, for example, and other foodstuffs. This is really important for food security. We talked about energy security. Food security is a big concern in the region. I will say that after COVID-19 and the coronavirus pandemic and the Gulf Rift in 2017 and 21, governments across the region took clear steps to enhance supply chains and make their and make tangible steps in terms of improving food security. So I think that they're in a better place than they would have been without those shocks happening over the past few years. But there's still going to be major disruptions, as many of the other speakers have said. This is unprecedented. Beyond food, food coming into the region, we've got disruption to different materials and inputs for construction. So we'd expect to see some, difficulties advancing various, construction projects as well. I mean, then we could talk about the goods that are coming from the region, going out to other markets as well. I mean, to bring China back into the picture, there are reports about, Chinese prices for sulfur, increasing. This is, as we know, a raw fertilizer material, and a lot of it, at least going to China, is coming, from the Gulf. So, I mean, there are a number of different commodities that we can look at that are going to be impacted from these trade disruptions. Then I think this is just maritime shipping that we're talking about. If we were to broaden the aperture a bit and we were to think about the aviation dimension, this is another area where we've seen massive disruptions and severe operational constraints. Now, there are some limited air corridors opening up, but this is going to be another area to watch very, very closely. I mean, the aviation and if we talk about the broader tourism and travel industry in the region, hugely important to a number of countries across the Gulf. I think in the UAE, tourism and travel, that broad sector constituted about 13% of the UAE's GDP last year. So, a sizable chunk of the economy is going to come back to these, critical sectors. So I think there'll be a big push moving forward to further develop and strengthen other trade routes, alternate trade routes, overland trade routes, and corridors in particular. This has already been happening. But to actually get these new trade routes, corridors, and the associated supply chains in place, that's going to take some time. It's not something that can be done overnight. And at the same time, there's just a huge degree of uncertainty that persists here. And if we're talking about, the impact that that's going to have on the broader investment environment, I think that it's going to slow the investment activity in the region. You've got firms, whether they're multinationals or investors, they're dealing with operational disruptions, trying to think about how to, manage continuity going forward. And investors are really trying to get a sense of where things are headed. So, I don't see. I think a lot of this just depends on the duration of the conflict and when we start to see less uncertainty and more certainty. And that's where, if you're looking even at energy, oil prices or regional stock markets, a lot of the big moves that we're seeing seem to be driven by indications of where this conflict is headed in the time frame too. So that certainly has been the case when I've been looking at regional stock markets and the movements of prices of different equities. There's a big focus on how long is this going to last, and I think that's where a lot of us are still stand at the moment and are trying our best to figure out.
Right, and I'm glad you mentioned alternate trade routes and corridors. In fact, that's one of the projects we're doing at ORF. ME is looking at the India, Middle East, Europe corridor, and how I think one of the propositions we are making is that we do need a web of networks instead of just relying on one single route. We do need a web which can help diversify and de-risk some of these trade. I think a quick follow-up, to you, and after that, I want to go to Robin, is that I know you've studied a lot about the sovereign wealth funds of the region, and I was reading recently how some of the sovereign wealth funds are really looking into parking some of their money and capital outside the region as well, particularly given, the situation here. So, how do you see the role of sovereign wealth funds evolving? Are they going to increasingly look at investing more outside the geography, outside the region to de-risk some of that capital? Your take?
It's a great question. A number of good folks from the media have asked the same question of me in the past few days. There's been huge interest in what sovereign wealth funds are going to do, and for good reason. I think to your point about parking capital outside of the region, well, this has been a major thrust of sovereign wealth fund investment strategies ever since they've created. So when you look at sovereign wealth fund portfolios, within these portfolios, in almost all cases, there is an international investment oriented segment of the portfolio. There's also a domestic segment of the portfolio, holdings in government related entities, state-owned entities, and the like. And where the fun part, for those of us who look at sovereign wealth funds, is trying to make sense of where fund officials and other governments are prioritizing how to leverage different parts of their portfolios and where to deploy capital. So to your point about will events in the region encourage governments or fund officials to deploy more investment capital outside of the region, I'm not so sure about that. I think that the investment, international investment is going to continue. That's very clear. But I think that there's going to be a very strong and compelling need for sovereign wealth funds to actually play an even more important role in their host economies going forward. So, I do fully expect that sovereign wealth funds will play an instrumental role supporting government efforts in the aftermath of this conflict, as things eventually wind down and the dust settles, to support government efforts to help government efforts to support affected industries, number one, but also help ensure that these economies and these investment ecosystems continue to remain attractive. And I think that the final point I'll say here is we'll be looking to see to what degree these sovereign wealth funds will be in a strong position to actually accomplish those objectives. I think if we fast forward a bit and we see hostilities die down sooner rather than later, and oil prices stay elevated, that actually sovereign wealth funds and even potentially government coffers in the region are going to be in relatively decent shape in order to accomplish some of those challenging objectives that I laid out. There are other scenarios that I think would make it harder for sovereign wealth funds to play such a role within their domestic economy. So, a lot of this is to bring it back to oil prices. An important variable here is going to be where oil prices stand and the time horizon of the hostilities that we're talking about.
Right. And I think it also sets a certain precedent that if they are willing to reinvest in their geographies, I guess they hope that the global capital will also find its way back in ways.
Well, yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, investing locally this is a trend that has been going on for, within the region for a number of years. The Public Investment Fund in Saudi Arabia has been a prime example of this, increasingly domestic focus associated with its investment strategy. And other funds have followed similar strategies to varying degrees. So I think it would be completely unprecedented if we see a kind of renewed efforts in that front. And I think that the last point too that's worth mentioning is sovereign wealth funds have the benefit of being long-term investors. They have there's a long-term horizon on their investments, and I think that enables these investment vehicles and the governments behind them to have the patience to look beyond the immediate urgency, of geopolitical developments like what are happening right now, and gives them some breathing room not to make necessarily rash decisions and completely reconstitute, investment portfolios or investment strategies. I think that they have a little bit more breathing room to play with, and I expect that they'll be taking advantage of that over the next few weeks and months.
Right. Robin, I want to come to you now. I think we've covered the Gulf, we've covered Russia, China, India, and I think I'm going to turn to you to look at the impact of this on Europe and Africa. So with Europe, as we know, it doesn't import a lot of Gulf LNG, but there is still some impact of the spot pricing that has led to, I think, about 45% increase in their gas prices as well. I think it does import about 30% of its jet fuel from the Strait, and that's also led to some impact on domestic prices in Europe. How do you see Europe really tackling this, situation, particularly, since it's been trying to manage a very complicated transition away from Russian energy?
Yes, as you say, Europe is not so dependent directly on Gulf oil and gas, but firstly, this is all interlinked, and secondly, as you say, Europe's going through this transition away from Russian oil and gas, correct and very necessary, and to a large extent forced on it. But nevertheless, Europe certainly comes into this crisis in a more exposed position. I mean, let's take gas first. This crisis, of course, comes Europe's just coming out of winter. Sorry, are you hearing me okay, Matt?
I can hear you, but it gets a little muffled in places, so you may want to just come a little closer to the.
I'll try to come a little closer. Yeah, so on the gas side, we're just coming out of winter in Europe, of course, and European gas stocks are low. I mean, that's normal. They've run down storage in winter to about 30% on average. Some countries much lower than that. And normally we'd now be getting into the refilling period, but that's going to be very difficult. I mean, in previous years, it would have been refilled with Russian gas. That's off the table, of course, and it'll would not then be refilled with LNG and primarily from the US. But now, of course, everybody's bidding for that flexible US LNG, and the major Asian buyers who don't have an alternative, so South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, particularly wealthy countries that are very dependent on LNG, are going to be prepared to pay whatever price they have to get those supplies. So it'll get very expensive for Europe, as it did in 2022. We're not at the crazy 2022 prices yet, but with a longer cutoff, the prices certainly will go quite a bit higher. And the losers will be countries that simply can't pay up. So it'll be Pakistan, Bangladesh, countries like this that simply can't afford LNG imports. And then there'll be a shift away from LNG for those countries that can do so. So China, we discussed, of course, switching back to coal to some extent. And so some countries have some flexibility. Europe will go back to coal as well to some extent in the power sector. How much it can do that is limited. But yes, it's going to be pretty challenging, and prices will be a lot higher. Obviously, depends how long the crisis is. We're coming into the lower demand period through the spring and summer in Europe. If it's a hot summer and there's a lot of air conditioning demand, and maybe and hydropower output is limited and so on, we have droughts, then Southern Europe will suffer. Italy, Spain, big LNG importers there. So there's a lot of exposure, and Europe might get lucky with the weather, or it may not. If the crisis is still dragging on as we come into September, October, then things get bad, because then Europe would be coming into that period with high prices and with very low gas stocks. The oil side is perhaps less of a direct concern, but oil price goes up for everybody. It's a global price, of course. There obviously are logistical issues, but broadly Europe will see the same kind of oil price shock as everybody else. And although we think Europe is more exposed to oil prices than the US, let's say, because the US is a big oil exporter, if you look at the oil that is used per capita in Europe, it's far less than the US, and because of taxes, the percentage increase in oil price at the pump for the average kind of European consumer will be a lot less than it will be in the US. So the shock in that sense is less, even if the macroeconomic impact is kind of if Europe is more exposed on the macroeconomic side. But there are some specifics. You mentioned jet fuel. The Gulf exports, as you say, 30% of Europe's jet fuel, a large part of it's diesel as well. So there are certainly some specific product related impacts, and Asian countries are seeing this too. The whole market is completely dislocated, and it'll take some weeks to months for tankers to get in the right place and shuffle supplies around, so that the pain of this can be a bit more evenly distributed.
Right. Just on the European prices, the carbon taxes are actually they really weigh in, on the pricing of energy in Europe. Do you think the governments will be willing to cut down on some of those carbon taxes in order to ease the blow on consumers?
Well, there's been talk about that, and the German Chancellor raised that a few days ago. And European carbon prices, there's a likely they will go up, because if Europe is getting less gas, and it'll to some extent turn back to coal with higher emissions, so more demand from the power sector for emissions permits, and that means less for everybody else. So somewhere in the system, carbon prices have to go up, unless there's a decision to relax that. I personally think that would be a mistake, and I think the German Chancellor's comments were pretty misguided. If the pain has to be allocated and compensated, there are better ways to do that. But nevertheless, there's always the political temptation to pull that lever, of course. So quite possible that's the way Europe will go.
Right. Can you maybe elaborate a little on those better ways?
Well, the whole point of the carbon market is to drive energy use to lower carbon alternatives, and Europe has been doing that progressively over the years. Not enough, but still significant. And the more solar, wind, other renewable sources, and nuclear power that Europe is using, obviously the less exposed it is to oil and gas prices and to volatility and shocks like this one. So it's a double win, a climate win and an economic or an energy security win. Now Europe, and particularly Germany, made some bad mistakes on nuclear. And Ursula von der Leyen was acknowledging that yesterday, I think, saying that in hindsight, phasing out nuclear in Germany was a bad idea. I'd say not just in hindsight, at the time, everybody who looked at it seriously said it was a bad idea too. Nevertheless, that's where we are. So the carbon price is meant to encourage this shift. Relaxing it just sends the wrong signal. Anybody who invested in solar and wind and batteries and other low carbon energy with the expectation of profiting is going to be harmed if the carbon price gets cut back. The better ways to do it are protect lower income consumers, And there are various ways to do that, direct cash transfers, for example, or minimum kind of energy supplies at lower costs, and then focus on tackling the vulnerabilities. So insulation, for example, improving the thermal performance of European homes so they need less gas for home heating. Installing heat pumps, heat pump take up in Europe has been very slow, and there's a whole bunch of just very practical kind of nitty gritty kind of issues to solve in improving basic things like that. You have hundreds of millions of homes across and buildings across Europe to retrofit. It's not a glamorous thing. It's not as glamorous as cutting the ribbon on a big solar power plant or a new nuclear power plant, but it's still very essential.
No, I mean, energy efficiency is, I think, the lowest hanging fruit in the whole toolbox for energy transitions for sure. Okay, really quickly on Africa, Robin, your thoughts. Africa, for instance, the energy prices are seen to be increasing in the continent. But more so than that, connectivity is a big concern in the continent because most of the countries are connected via the Gulf. And now with aviation sector being disrupted, the continent is facing increasing energy prices, increasing food prices, trade is completely stalled. So how do you see Africa really, how do you see it? Where do you see Africa fit into this equation, and what should it do to be able to mitigate some of these impacts?
So Africa, the exposure is very varied, right? So you've got energy exporters in Africa, countries like Nigeria, Angola, and so on, who will, and at least in a macro sense, will do well out of this with higher oil and gas prices. And then you have the energy importing countries, which are going to face tough times, and not so much on gas because hardly any African country other than Egypt really imports gas, but certainly very much on the oil side. Of course, oil prices will go up and have gone up and will go up more. And the Gulf is a very important logistical supplier to Africa, particularly East Africa, of refined products. So they'll see the same logistical disruption that we talked about for other areas. And Africa, of course, most African countries don't have the financial resources to outbid others for these oil supplies. They don't have strategic stocks in reserve. We talked about India having rather limited strategic stocks, but most African countries have nothing. So Africa is certainly particularly the energy importing countries, very exposed. The mining sector, of course, is a big consumer of energy, particularly diesel. Prices there will go up. So, okay, maybe the higher minerals commodity prices will help compensate that. But the mining sector is certainly exposed on the energy side. That said, I would say that Africa, fortunately, has made big strides the past couple of years in renewables, particularly solar power, really taking off in that regard. So there is a hope, I think, that'll cushion the blow, certainly on the electricity side, and African countries will see even more impetus now to install more solar power and improve electricity availability. And on the logistics, yeah, absolutely. The Gulf, particularly Dubai, of course, is a huge hub for African travel and business. And if you want to fly from, let's say, Cote d'Ivoire to Tanzania, very likely you'll go through the Gulf rather than going direct. So that blow on connectivity is going to disrupt African business activities and as well. And we've also seen quite a lot of outbound investment from the Gulf into Africa in the past few years in the renewable energy sector, in the mining sector. Presumably that's going to come to a halt, at least temporarily.
Right. Thank you for that, Robin. I think we've unpacked quite a bit in this panel. But before we close, maybe I thought we could do a very last closing round, which could be 30 seconds, last closing thoughts on what is the future of energy systems. Will this crisis really be that inflection point? Will we go back to that over-reliance on gas and oil from select geographies? Or do we see greater diversification of energy sources, greater push for energy transitions? How will the economies partner with one another? Will we see new alliances being formed? So I think just closing thoughts, and maybe this time we can start with you, Robert. Let's flip it, and maybe we'll go the other way around.
Sure. I'll give what may be a somewhat unsatisfying answer and say it's too early to tell. But what I'd look for to make a better assessment over the days and weeks ahead are two factors, really. One is the duration of this conflict, and second is the nature of hostilities. So I think it's safe to say that the duration of this Iran conflict is still the most important variable here in moving the needle one way or the other. But it's very hard to get clarity. I mean, we're hearing from administration officials in Washington, a number of weeks, 3 to 4. There are various baseline expectations out there that expect hostilities to come to an end, within a month. So we'll see. I think this is going to have a huge impact on whether or not we reach some kind of inflection point across a range of different sectors and economic activities. And the second part, along the way is how does this conflict continue to unfold? What are the nature of hostilities? And do we see any, incidents that really change calculations in one direction or the other? If you look at regional stock markets and their responses, we're not necessarily seeing, cumulative pressure on, equity prices from one incident to the next. There's a lot of seesawing back and forth as people are looking to see, how long this is actually going to last. And when someone like President Trump says we're nearly there, and it's, there's some indication perhaps that things will wind down. We see big movements in different markets. So I think a lot of that, again, it's still going to come back to it's going to come back to how long this persists. And in the aftermath, I think it is safe to say, though, that there's going to be an elevated geopolitical risk premium on a number of different sectors and economic activities. This is something that governments, investors and firms, they're just going to have to contend with. And a lot of us here on this call and others who've worked in the region, lived in the region, studied the region for a long time, and we knew these risks were there. I think Robin started the conversation by saying something along those lines. But perhaps, we underestimated the extent of this risk, actually materializing. It was perhaps somewhat underappreciated, and now we're seeing, this worst case play out.
Yes. Thanks for that, Robert. Kaveri, quick
I
30
think
seconds.
I'll feed off what Robert just said about the nature of hostilities. I would argue that the nature of hostilities will determine the duration of the conflict. When you hit energy, when you hit water, these are infrastructure. This is infrastructure which is very difficult. It's very difficult to find off ramps, because that affects civilian life. And I would argue that the duration of the conflict, I think, will be determined by this nature of the hostilities. And the long-term implication of this could be the securitization. I think the inflection point you are hoping for, Manath, in terms of transition, I'm sorry, that is not the answer I would give. I would think the inflection point would come in terms of how securitization of the Strait of Hormuz or other choke points is looked at. Because what Iran has shown with the ability to close by just the mere threat of closure is that there is an asymmetric advantage that technology gives warfare today. And I think that is going to be passed on in other scenarios as well. So you have to consider the fact that you have to look at energy infrastructure and protecting that energy infrastructure, fortifying energy infrastructure differently. And I think that is going to be the primary takeaway from this conflict. We are, I suspect, going to go back to the old ways of dependence on fossil fuels. At least in the medium term. But I think it is securitization which will be the principal takeaway from this conflict. I think
Interesting how the Gulf states reached out to Ukraine, to learn
exactly.
to
In
secure
fact,
and safeguard their energy infrastructure.
Correct. In fact, after the Russia-Ukraine war, there was so much destruction in the energy infrastructure at that time. I would have thought it would have been factored in. I imagine it has been factored in. I'm sure governments are factoring it in, but there must be a better way to do it. If there is war gaming that is being done for a Taiwan contingency, or if you're looking at things around the Indian subcontinent as well, I think energy infrastructure, including cybersecurity, I think these are considerations that will come directly into play after this particular incident, this particular war.
Right. I was actually on a webinar the other day, and I think one of the aspects they spoke about was risk assessments, how that will become increasingly important today, not just for governments, but also for institutions and companies, where they will want to look at cybersecurity and other kind of security associated risks before making investments and trade. But Mikhail, over to you now.
I mean, I guess just to what you were saying about security assessments, they are important. They've always been important. It just feels like we have so many unknown factors, right? Hormuz, that's been the main risk for 35 years, and yet it's been discounted maybe because everybody assumed that the US Navy would step in. So I guess it's just even becoming harder to try and quantify the risk and the nature of the risk because it's coming from, I guess, the most surprising areas. But to your question, I'll take it in a slightly different direction and actually pose more questions or perhaps contradictions that I see than answers. I think for China, there's certainly the balance will be between coal and renewables. Gas is already small. It will be even smaller, I think, because of these risks. And as Kaveri was saying, coal has been and remains the sort of backbone of the Chinese energy system, along with renewables. I think that's only going to intensify. So for China, the question now becomes the energy security questions are about power system resilience, flexibility, hardware, software, and we're seeing that in the 5-year plan as well. So there's sort of continuity there, but it only gets amplified and accelerated. In terms of clean tech, and again, we were talking about this. Yes, there's a greater need for China, or there might be greater demand for Chinese exports of clean tech, but the risks around dependency, I mean, in Europe, that is a salient area of debate right now. How dependent do you want to become on Chinese clean tech? The risks are different, right? It's not a flow, it's an industrial. But arguably, the risks are even greater because if your industrial base is decimated, that's a different type of risk. And so for Chinese investors, they go overseas and they start to invest. But where do you invest right now? Back to your risk assessment. Where is it safe? Is it Latin America? But the US wants to undermine Chinese influence in Latin America. Is it in the Middle East? Who do you partner with? So I think this opens up a whole new can of worms of sort of where do you take the energy transition and how? Because ways of doing business will have to change. And finally, I think there's another question about sort of China's role in the geopolitics of energy. A little bit to echo sort of what, Kaveri was saying that Indian stakeholders were looking and saying, why are Indian tankers not transiting Hormuz? I think there's a lot of myths about who's actually transited. But even within Chinese shipping communities, you saw people sort of say, why don't we have a naval escort for our tankers? And there's growing pressure domestically, internationally for China to take a stronger role. I think some people have sort of said that this conflict highlights China's weakness internationally. I don't think that's the case. But there's this push and pull between can China do something to protect its own interests, to mediate in the conflict, which I don't think they'll want to do, right? They're very pragmatic right now. But beyond that sort of broader geopolitical and strategic role, there's the role of the Chinese architecture of trading. So questions like renminbi settling in Chinese currency and all these alternatives to the dollar-based system, I think will take time, but I think it's an interesting area to watch.
Right, and I thought it was my job to ask questions, but thank you. Those are great questions, and maybe, we can park them for our next follow-up session. But Lee Chen, over to you, and maybe I'll just pick up something from what Miguel said, and if you could address that, US naval ships, $20 billion reinsurance scheme. How hopeful you are that'll work?
Yeah, so if US naval ships, I think as some of us know, it's not clear solution because apparently the US Navy can only escort certain kinds of ships, right? Legally, those with a US flag, those with US crew, for example, or those with US bound cargo. So there's some restrictions. Okay, it's easy to shift flags. We all know that you just go to the registry and do it online. Yes, so you can shift flags and that kind of thing. But without a political solution, without a kind of like an agreement to cease fire, I can't imagine that the Americans would be happy to divert military kind of projects to escort civilian ships in the Hormuz. So I'm not too sure about how that's going to work. With regards to some closing thoughts, I want to pick up on what Bob said about the resilience of the Gulf economies. And I think one thing we haven't mentioned is about the expatriate workers, right? You talked a lot about commodities, Bob, but expatriate workers and labor is something that's really important. right? Right now, there isn't an exodus, but there are certainly companies, especially American companies, because of insurance reasons, who have asked their workers based in the Gulf to leave because the insurance doesn't cover war insurance, etc. So we've seen quite a few expat workers in the oil industry, for example, exiting. And the question is, how long will they be gone for? Obviously, depends on the conflict. And I think so this Hormuz thing and the war itself is an inflection point for thinking about how after the war, AI will have a bigger role, right? In terms of maintenance and stuff like that, which the expat oil and gas workers have done. And also about more training for the locals because they are there, they don't leave, as they don't have the options to leave so quickly. So I think that is one inflection point in terms of labor. The second inflection point that most people think of when they talk about this war, Hormuz, is, it's going to be good for renewable energy, right? That's quite the kind of quick answer. But I think that's kind of a red herring because what this shows is it's not as an inflection point for renewable energy, but it causes people to think again about what's important. And it's not so much renewable energy that's the answer for all countries. It's more about thinking of energy security. All right, so renewable energy might work for countries which are, say, resource poor or rather fossil fuels poor, right? But it's not exactly going to be the solution for resource-rich countries that have coal or other kinds of fossil fuels, because they're looking, the question is indigenous energy security, right? What can I do to make my domestic energy system more resilient and less dependent on imports? So the answer to that may not always be renewable energy, particularly if you have to import a lot of stuff, right? It could be just going back to some kind of fossil fuels or maybe nuclear for those who have the financial capabilities. So I'll stop there.
Thank you for bringing in nuclear and also labor dynamics and movements. I thought they both were something we couldn't cover during the discussion before, but extremely crucial to the session. Robin, finally to you, quick closing thoughts.
Well, finally, look, this whole event is clearly going to give a big impetus to the alternative energy sector. We've seen attempts, by opponents of climate action, particularly in Europe and the US, to say that renewables and so on are unreliable. This absolutely is painting this the other way. And I think there'll be a real battle of narratives during this conflict and when it's over. And so there's already attempts in the UK, let's say, to say, the government's net zero policies have put the UK in a bad position. But I think the message is quite the opposite. If the attempt to build up renewables in the UK, for example, has been very successful and helped give the UK some more resilience in this situation that it wouldn't have had otherwise. And we see that in the Gulf too. The Gulf countries have their own domestic energy needs, and the UAE's building up its nuclear and solar power capacity gives it a lot more resilience than some of its neighbours as their oil and gas production is interrupted. So there's going to be a big debate on narratives on this, but I think the message will be quite clear, and I'm sure that low carbon energy promoters and climate campaigners and so on will have a pretty easy argument to make about the advantages of low carbon energy, renewables, and potentially nuclear versus fossil fuels.
Right. Thank you, Robin, and thank you all for such very insightful reflections. I know I'm over time, but I just couldn't resist, deep diving and asking more because this has truly been quite incredible. I think we've learned quite a bit and we've covered plenty of ground, but I think if there's one thing that's really clear is that energy security remains deeply intertwined with geopolitics. And as the global energy system will evolve, balancing security, resilience, and transition will be more important than ever. So thank you, and I hope we get to do another round of this soon once the situation will hopefully settle.
Thank you, Manat. Thank you for all the insightful discussion comments.